Good evening, and welcome to the Kidlit for Black Lives Town Hall. If you're watching on Zoom, you can pin the interpreter's video. We will also have closed captioning on YouTube after the broadcast. A lot of Black parents have the talk with their children. The talk is when you want to prepare your child for an eventual confrontation or interaction or appearance by an officer of the law. Generally, that talk involves no sudden gestures. Say yes, sir, and no, sir. Be poised. When I was 11 years old, I had my first interaction with police officers. I had never been given the talk. My father was the headmaster of my school in Brooklyn, New York. One morning, I woke up and my father said, "We are not going to school today." And of course, I thought, yes, this is great, no school, until he told me the reason. We were gonna march over the Brooklyn Bridge to protest police brutality, yet another Black man had been killed in Crown Heights. I immediately began to cry. I am not marching over the Brooklyn Bridge, I told him, because I was afraid they were going to open the bridge and we were all going to die. This was what my 11-year-old self told me. That was, of course, impossible, but I believed it. I was afraid, I was full of fear, and my father dragged me kicking and screaming to this march. There were 3,000 of us on the Brooklyn Bridge, and we were marching over, and I'm crying, and my friends are looking at me like, what's wrong with Kwame? And we get to the other side of the bridge in Manhattan, and there are police officers on horses. The police officers are in riot gear. There are barking dogs. And I'm in the front line of this rally, of this march, of this protest against police brutality because my father is the headmaster of the school. And I'm bawling because I think this is the day that Kwame Alexander's life ends at the hands of police officers. And then something happened. Someone in the protest started singing. We're fired up, we can't take no more. We're fired up, we can't take no more. We're fired up, we can't take no more. And then my friends started singing, and then my father started singing, and then I start singing. And while I'm singing, I sort of find I find solid ground. I gain my footing. I feel comfortable. I stop crying. The tears are gone, and I've found my voice, and I've lifted it. I wasn't able to articulate it then, but that was the moment where I found my voice. That was the moment where I realized that you've got to lift your voice for the things that mattered. That was the moment where I felt confident in who I was. Now, going through the rest of my life, every time I interacted with a police officer, I knew that fear. I remembered that crying, and I knew what that felt like. But I still felt like I was worthy and I was valued. I think so often when we have this talk, we forget that the talk is really about strategy. We want our kids to come home safely, so we want to prepare them, but we don't want them to be defined by that interaction, by that moment. We don't want them to think they are less than. We want them to still think they are empowered and they are powerful. So it's strategy. It is this history that comes to mind when I've had to answer the following question quite a few times over the past few weeks. Why is it our responsibility as Black people to educate white people on racism and anti-racism? Perhaps it is not that it is our responsibility, but it is our expertise. Perhaps it is not our purpose, but it is our expertise. Not only are the panelists tonight subject matter experts in this field, but tween and teen Black children are PhDs in it because we've lived it. This is what Jonathan Kozol wrote. He said that white people will probably go on leading normal lives and will go on participating in the nation in a normal way unless there comes a time when Black people can compel white people by methods of extraordinary pressure to interrupt the pleasure. And James Baldwin spoke this call to action to Black people when he said, you have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with its idea of you. The idea of us is that we laugh, love, live just like everybody else, that we are human beings and our humanity must be honored and embraced. How do we create empathetic, connected adults who value Black life? It begins with molding and shaping and nurturing empathetic and connected and loving children. And that's what tonight's about. We are fired up and we can't take no more. And so we accept our role as truth tellers. Listen, learn, and then go out into the world and live the kind of life you claim you want for your children. Set this world right. As my friend Belinda Nicholson at the American School in London says, or as you see on the news every day, we will set it alight. I am honored to be here today to recognize the two organizations that have made this town hall meeting possible. The International Literacy Association and the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I'd like to now introduce two of the representatives from those esteemed organizations. Dr. Stephen Peters is the Vice President of the International Literacy Association. He's been a classroom teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, a director of secondary education, and a superintendent during his more than 35 years in education. April Powers is the first Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators in their 50-year history. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, April. Thank you, Kwame. And thanks to all of our panelists and viewers. This is an important moment in history. As parents, families, communities, educators, and others struggle with ways to find the pathway forward, we at ILA stand with you firmly to find solutions. We are members of a vibrant, thoughtful, and caring community. A community who believes it's our responsibility to work together to create a more racially just society and world. We know that as an international community of educators, we can do more together than as isolated individuals. In many respects, our work and collective efforts will help shape the future. In my work as a superintendent, I've seen firsthand the impact of synergy as we continue to create constructive spaces in a destructive world. As a father and grandfather, I am in awe of literacy and the opportunities it offers our children and families. Recently, I heard a governor say that poverty is the enemy of education. We at ILA say that literacy is the vaccine for poverty. Tonight's event is about taking action. ILA is all about promoting change, being an integrated part of change, and most importantly, empowering others to facilitate change. Taking a stand is good. We've seen many organizations, companies, agencies issue statements. That's good. But now it's time to do something. So thanks for the emails and the social media posts. But now it's time for action. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? And what are we going to do together to make this world a better place? April.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Kwame, and all of the panelists and participants and viewers that are watching that care about this very important issue. The Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, we're honored to support this series, and we have silently for some time. And at this heartbreaking time in the history of our human family, we recognize and affirm that Black Lives Matter, Black children's lives matter, Black authors, illustrators, and translators' lives matter all around the world. They matter so much that we encourage you as teachers, as parents, as librarians. We're going to ask you not to relegate stories about Black lives just to a shelf during the shortest month of the year. We're going to ask you to make room on the shelf. There's plenty of room all year long for real stories about real Black families, not just the historical challenges of Black children and families, but we can also showcase regular joy and the common humanity of Black people, because all children need to see that in literature. All people need to see that in literature. And better yet, my appeal to everyone watching is if you have a book in your soul, an illustration or translation in your soul, please join us at SCBWI. We want you here, no matter where you are in the world. We know that these stories matter because stories humanize. Before there was ever a printed press or word on a page, we've had stories. We have stories in the Bible, in the Quran, in the Torah. Every culture has stories. And those are the things that humanize us, they bond us. And we thank you for everything you're doing to elevate this conversation, Kwame, and everyone with Kidlit and Brown Bookshelf. And thank you all for being here to learn more.
Thank you, April. So now for the main town hall discussion, which is geared towards teachers and librarians who are going to be going back into the classroom this fall. How are you going to approach your classroom? What tools do you need to create the kind of classroom that embraces the beauty and the joy and the power of Blackness? Cornelius Minor is a Black father, a globally recognized educator and a lover of books. He has dedicated his life to reading a generation of word warriors, children who can wield crayons, pencils, and pens to build and heal. Dr. Noni Thomas López just completed her second year as the head of school at the Gordon School in East Providence, Rhode Island, a racially diverse nursery through 8th grade independent school committed to fostering empathy, joyful learning, intellectual leadership, and a stimulating drive for positive societal impact. Pam Allyn is an educational innovator and founder of the award-winning global nonprofit Lit World. She's the author of many books and programs for parents, caregivers, and teachers on the power of literacy and story to promote justice and equity and to empower children to live lives of impact and joy. Tiffany Jewell is an anti-racist Montessori educator and has been working with children and families for 18 years. She's the author of This Book is Anti-Racist and the proud mama of 2 young storytellers. And Karyn Parsons, best known for her role as Will Smith's ditzy cousin, Hillary Banks. I ain't say ditzy, that was in her bio, y'all. On NBC's The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. These days, Karyn is founder and producer of Sweet Blackberry, an award-winning series of children's animated films that share stories of unsung Black heroes in history. She's also the author of a really amazing middle grade novel called How High the Moon. Please welcome our panelist.
And good evening, everyone. We are so thrilled that you have joined us on this occasion to talk and to build together. I want to remind you before we get started that we are taking questions from the Q&A section of Zoom, if you're joining us that way, or from Facebook or from Twitter. And so this evening's first question goes out to you, Dr. Noni. You know, in these moments that can feel so heavy, educators and parents alike sometimes want to have these conversations with children, But then they look at their school boards and their school leadership teams and their neighborhoods or faith organizations, and they say to themselves, I can't do this, I'll get in trouble. How can people make community and institutional space to do this work?
Thank you, Cornelius. I'm very excited to be here with everyone this evening. I think we're living in, a moment. Dr. Peters referred to it before we got on live. The panelists were talking about this may be a moment if you were worried about your job or getting in trouble. This is probably the moment where you could put that aside to speak truth to power, meaning that if Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben are going out the door, if Aunt Taylor can say Black Lives Matter, then there's a moment for us to step into to call those folks to the table to say, if you're saying those things, then what are you doing? What's the action that demonstrates that the things that you're putting forth are actually what you believe in and are going to do the work to make happen. So in terms of educators, we, whether you're at an independent school like me at Gordon School in East Providence, or public schools, charter schools, we have well-articulated missions, and most of them talk about creating inclusive communities, communities of belonging, empowering young children, creating courageous leaders. We all have language like that in our mission statements, and if they aren't articulated in mission statements, they are certainly a part of the work that we say that we're doing. So superintendents, principals, leaders can go to school boards, go to boards of trustees and say, our mission says that we do this, that we believe in this. What does that look like? Because if we have families that feel like, children that feel like they have to leave pieces of their identity outside the front doors of our schools in order to feel some sense of belonging, then we aren't doing what our missions say we are. So start with our missions, the statements that we make publicly, and feel empowered, I think, in this moment more than any other, to ask folks about the action that is happening behind the words.
Thank you. And Pam, this makes me think so much about your work. You have been a mentor to me and a champion of teachers. Where do teachers start? What are the habits or practices that teachers should adopt?
I think, and Noni said it too, I think this idea that teachers, librarians, everybody who is creating space for children have so much power, actually. They're that power in that, creating that sense of belonging, creating opportunities for our young people to read texts that represent everybody, that represent the world of themselves and the world around them. And also that idea that the norms that might be happening outside that community or that classroom are norms we can break by actually creating something new. That as Noni said, I think that we have a moment, we have an opportunity now, we have an opportunity to fight back against the oppression of the education system, and to say, in this room, this is a room where we can talk back to text. We can talk back to what was supposed to be the canon and isn't anymore. We can talk back to all of the things that maybe seem to have been the norms in this environment for teachers. This is such an opportunity to actually really create space for centering our children's voices and making those voices the way we follow the voices of our children. And I think that for right now too, to really understand that as a teacher, you have so much power to create space that others can emulate, to create the spaces that our young people can go home and have more of those conversations and push back against those norms and say, these norms are racist, they don't work, they're not gonna work. And let's really open them up and have the conversation in the space that we're in as teachers to be a space of inquiry, of pushing back on the text, of pushing back on the talk, of pushing back on those norms and saying, this is the moment, everything can change.
Wow, and I just love that idea of being in the moment. And Karyn, as I think about your work, we want kids to be aware, but we also want them to be kids. And we want them to be proud, and we want them to be powerful. And I think about what you've done with your book and with Sweet Blackberry. How can parents and educators balance the truth with beauty?
Well, I mean, I think, well, with books, obviously, books give us this incredible opportunity to step into the world of somebody who's entirely different from them, possibly from a different time and place, as well as different skin. I think it's really important for all children to be given books about Black and brown children. I think there's been a lot of push I've witnessed with books getting into the hands of Black children, which is great. But I think it's really important that everyone is included in learning about people that might not be look exactly like them, and they can step into their shoes and they can feel a sense of empathy and develop empathy for people that they might not know. In How High the Moon, for instance, we're talking about the Jim Crow South, an 11-year-old girl in Jim Crow South. And even though she lives in a very different time, I really wanted kids to be able to feel for her and understand her and walk around with her and smell the things she smells and relate to a lot of the things that she's interested in, that they're also interested in. And next thing you know, you've got somebody who's wrapped up in a character that they feel so much for and they identify with, even if she doesn't look like them, even if they're not from the same time. And I think that translates into their life. And I think if teachers can get these books and librarians into the hands of kids, all kids, and then also open up discussion, talk about things, and let the kids lead sometimes too, see where they're going and the questions that they have. It's easy for us to have these agendas and things we think are important. I think it's really important though to let the kids lead and listen and see what it is that they're missing that maybe we're not realizing. I think that's all really important. The same with the Sweet Blackberry stories. The idea was to empower kids, but to bring history to them in a fun and engaging way, especially little kids. I mean, they want to be engaged. They want to have a good time. I wanted to tell those stories the way we tell fairy tales, and you know everything about them, but they're engaging. And we have to remember that kids need to feel like they relate to it in some way to pull them in often. And I think that's the real opportunity that the books can give them. I think we should definitely take advantage of. There's so much great stuff out there right now.
Oh, and as I think about your work, Tiffany, it feels like you've been trying to tell us your whole career. You know, you've been thinking about anti-Black racism. You've been thinking about how we've become anti-racist. How can parents even start to do this work with their families? How does it go? What are the first steps?
Yeah, the first steps, parents, adults, family, caregivers, we teachers, educate, like all the adults need to do this work ourselves too, and not feel like it's our job and our role to impart anti-racist beliefs into our students, in our children, because we're modeling. We need to model making mistakes. We need to model unpacking our biases. We need to show them that it's possible. And then when raising children, when having them in our classrooms, our role is to listen to them and really listen to them, not listen with like a quick comeback, but listen to them, gently call them in and out when they're showing biased stereotype behavior, and also honor them, because even the youngest kiddos, they know and they see injustice. And if we kind of let that slide and we don't give them the language and the opportunity to talk about what they're observing and they're feeling, then we're telling them this isn't important. And it's so important, like our lives depend on it.
Wow. You know, and I've got so many brilliant folks here with me right now. And if I could ask, could someone give us some historical perspective? You know, because for so many Americans, it goes something like Lincoln freed the slaves, then Martin Luther King gave a speech and racism was over. So why are we even having this conversation?
I'll start there. I think that one of the important things about the work of anti-racism, particularly in the United States, and that's where I'm kind of keeping my comments in context about race in this country, and dealing with, I think, what many believe is the original sin of this country, the genocide of the indigenous peoples here and the enslavement of African peoples here. How do we confront that history and interrogate it and move to something like truth and reconciliation without understanding the through line of 1619 to today, and that there's a direct line to the things that we're seeing, experiencing, that Black people are seeing, experiencing, to enslavement, to Jim Crow, to segregation, to mass incarceration. And Brian Stevenson does amazing work educating folks through the Legacy Museum and the lynching memorial of that connection. It is a painful history, but one that's important for us to face as a country, because we can't move to that place of reconciliation without facing that. And beside all of that, and why I think art and literature is so important in the work that we do as educators and what we expose our children to as parents, is because alongside that difficult history is so much joy and resilience and love and power. It is the story of African Americans, of Black people in this country, is of one that should be celebrated. And how do our children see that? How is that story told? I think we have so many options for that, but we also have the work to do of facing our history and making sure that we're seeing that through line that I spoke about, that is not that far in the past. Some of us have, grandparents that are 1 or 2 generations from folks who were enslaved in this country. What does that mean for the opportunities that that Blacks have in this country, in education, economic-wise, et cetera? And what's the work that we're doing? We can't do the work of changing the laws, of legislation, of economic empowerment without understanding the history. And so I think that work is an important first step in anti-racist work, ones we can guide our children in with appropriate materials, and one that is also filled with stories of joy and love as well.
Wow, and there's this belief out there, right, that a lot of people still think that racism means that I was mean to a Black person or I said the N-word. So if I'm nice to my 3 Black friends and I've never said any bad words, how can I be racist? Could somebody help us to get a sense of like, what is racism in the context that we're talking about it now?
When I talk about racism, the definition that I use, because language is so important. Language really defines how we understand each other or how we don't understand what we're talking about. And so for me, racism is personal prejudice and bias and the misuse and abuse of power. And that's a definition like young kids can understand it, adults can understand it, and it also allows us to see that being nice isn't going to end racism. It allows us to understand that we need to do more than just unpack our own biases, but we have to move it into the institutions which are made up by us people. We all make up the institutions. We have to move that unpacking into our institutions and look at the policies and the procedures and the laws. I think there are so many laws that are ridiculous that we don't even know about. And those are things that people can get pulled over for. And we know what happens when people get pulled over now. We see it all the time in social media. So understanding the language and really looking at what the definition of racism is really helps us to see that it's not just a personal thing, which is really hard because for so long we've been taught that if you're nice to people, that's the thing that matters most.
So if a Black person was mean to me once and it made me cry, isn't that reverse racism then? So as like, and I'm really attempting to spell this out for the folks in our audience. So I want to be really clear then. So teaching our kids to be kind isn't enough. So then how do we begin to teach these multi-layered histories that Dr. Noni and Karyn talked about and that you're talking about, Tiffany, to our kids?
Take it. Truth. We tell them the truth.
Yeah.
And I think, understanding what is developmentally appropriate. I'm not going to show my 4-year-old pictures of bodies hanging from trees. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to talk about history. And when we look at history, we're also going to look at how people worked in solidarity together. I think that is a part of our history that we don't get told a lot. How long did it take me to learn about the Black Panther Party supporting the 504 protest? It took me, that was a couple years ago, and I'm 39. So it really starts with our children, with telling them the truth and honoring their identities too, not just telling them about history, but they want to know where they are in the world and who they are. So we also do a lot of work in our home and in my classrooms and with all the kids I work with on understanding who you are. Naming your skin color. White is not a dirty word. You are white though. You're called white. Our skin is called brown. Our skin is called black. And really kind of naming all of that. And again, it's that building that collective language to really help kids understand what is happening in the world. And it's a great start.
Can I say something really quickly about that? I just love hearing that so much, because I think it's been such a, we've been told it's almost like it's a thing like money, like it's you have to be polite and not talk about it. Like you're polite and you don't talk about money, you're polite and you don't talk about race. And we've been kind of I feel like we've been gaslit. Or I know in my growing up, it was kind of like that whole colorblind attitudes that so many people have had, and well-meaning people, I have to add to that. I think people have meant well with the whole I don't see color. And it's so good and refreshing to hear Tiffany, you talking about that, because I think it's so important that we are honest with kids, that we're talking to them directly about these things, that we're not shying away from it and pretending it'll go away, or whatever people are trying to do for so long, and that we're hitting things head on. And I think that's one of the things right now that's exciting to me with what's going on in the world, is even though we can sit back and we can be a little bit skeptical or nervous about whether things are really going to change. But I think even on the fact that we're talking about it as much as we are, and it's forcing it into the forefront so that we're able to bring kids into the conversation and they want to know about it. I think that alone is really important. And I'm seeing so many people, so many white people for the first time, really taking a hard look at things and asking questions. And I'm happy to say that for the most part, I've seen people allow people their questions too, which is also important. And people, I know in my son's school, sometimes kids that aren't white kids are usually, they don't feel safe asking questions. They rather just not talk about it because they're so afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. And so I think that that's really important. I just wanted to jump in and say something about that.
Oh, that's huge, Karyn. Yeah.
I think teachers and parents feel that discomfort too around talking about race. And we'll hear a young child maybe say something like, look, there's a brown person, and everyone freaks out. Understanding that for young people, it's how they start to categorize and make sense of the world. So they're noticing those differences. The problem comes when there starts to be associations with those differences, or negative associations with those differences. And those can come explicitly or not. It can be, young children can kind of breathe in, Beverly Daniel Tatum calls about the smog of racism. And so young children are breathing in kind of messages. And a parent might say, I never said that, thought that, I know how, an idea of if something came out of a young child's mouth that was, it was racist, but they're breathing those things in. So if we're not actively countering those messages, then they're going to stick. And I think that's if you're avoiding those conversations with your children because you think they're too young or you're uncomfortable, then you're leaving them kind of breathing toxic air. So we want to kind of infuse our children with fresh air through having these conversations. And I think literature is a beautiful way to open that up, to have children exposed to different narratives than they may experience in their daily lives. At Gordon, we use the language of windows and mirrors. Windows to see the experience of others, and mirrors to have your experience affirmed back to yourself. And I think that's the power of literature and how that can open a door for adults to have these sometimes uncomfortable conversations with children. I think literature provides a really beautiful pathway to that.
Just add to that to say that the narrative, or responding to the multiple narratives of text, with our children having their own narratives, their own text to respond, to write, to storytell, to tell the stories of their ancestors in their languages, to make that world of literacy be more than just the text that we've brought into the classroom, but also the text of the child's life, him or herself, their selves, that those texts also really matter to this conversation. And one thing I just was listening to, Jason Reynolds was recently speaking, and he was talking about the journey of our entire lives, this journey of working towards anti-racism and working towards that work will be the work we do till the very end of our lives. And I think that that's something that I think gives me strength, is to say I'm a messy. I'm not sure I know how to do this, but I want to keep doing this. I want to work on this for the rest of my life as the best I can. And I want my children, my students, to see that too, our own daughters, to see that it's the work we continue to do. And I think we do it with text, and we do it with the narratives of our students and our own children too.
Sorry, Cornelius.
Oh no, this is so beautiful. Like, I'm just in awe of all of you. And one of the things that I'm beginning to wonder, especially as I think about this audience, is what are the specific behaviors that parents and educators should be modeling consistently for white children to learn how to live anti-racism?
It goes back to truth. Like, I keep thinking, so if my children are white presenting, and if they ask a question and I don't tell them the truth, they're going to create their own answer for it. And that answer is going to be infused with stereotypes and biases that are all around them, whether we address them or not. And so the truth is, like, truth telling in our home is really important. And with white children and white presenting children and children who are light and have privilege because of their light skin color, it's really important to, in our house, I shared last night with these folks too, like it's really important that my boys don't take up space, because for too long, white and light folks have taken up way too much space, and it's their time to step aside. And their role is also to observe and witness the world around them, to become really conscious of what is around them. So then we can figure out, through the process of the framework, the liberatory consciousness framework from Dr. Barbara J. Lev, we go through the phase of becoming aware and then analyzing what is happening in the world around us, and then how are we going to take action on that, and not just like observe and sit back. What is the action we're going to take? Whether it's making a sign, whether it's standing up for your friend, whatever that is, we have to support our young folks into moving into action and knowing that they are accountable to a community that's bigger than their family.
Wow, and you hit us with two big terms there that I just wanted to name for our audience. You talked about privilege, right? And the privilege that white folks and white presenting folks have, and light-skinned folks have. And people ask all the time, I work hard for everything I got. How can I be privileged if me and my white children have struggled too? How can teachers begin to confront that idea?
I think one of the things that's important when talking about privilege is looking at you know, racism, as, you know, Tiffany talked about, as this systemic force, and thinking about a power who uses it and misuses it, I think gives us a good entry point. One of the things that I confront at times with white parents is this feeling, I don't want my child to feel guilty about being white. And I think looking at racism as a system that white folks can have a power in dismantling removes some of that that position of powerlessness, of feeling like, well, I can't do anything about what happened back in history, right? Number one, we know those things are still happening. And two, there's something that white folks can do about it, and white children can do about it. And my bet is that there are so many white children wondering what they can do about it. So rather than kind of leaning on, you know, you don't have to feel guilty about this, or, you know, we worked hard too, and we face challenges. Let's face the reality, as Tiffany said, the truth. And what are we going to do to break down the system that's hurting so many of us, white folks included? Just taking a different path and centering Black folks for a second, I think that another important thing for us to be doing in the work, and anti-racist work, is viewing self-care as a liberatory practice, and attending to our self-care like we are going to a protest, like we're writing a book or that article, like we're, you know, producing the video or music, is attending to our self-care and seeing it as that important and integral to the struggle and to transformation. I think there's a lot of emotional labor that Black folks are giving over to this work to pull white folks along. And again, I think we're in an important moment, if we can take advantage of it, to have and call on white folks to take that on. And I think that's part of the work that Tiffany's doing with her children, is saying, this is the work that you're responsible for in this. And so I think that making sure that Black folks are taking care of themselves through doing anti-racist work is an important part of the work too.
And I'm thinking about all of you, and I have admired your work for so long. And one of the things that's really coming to mind for me is that Black families, and Kwame talked about this earlier, have to hold multiple versions of the talk as a strategy to make sure that their kid doesn't become the next Michael Brown. And so what should be the talking points in the talk that non-Black parents give consistently to their children?
In our house, again, like I'll repeat, it's my 4 and my 8-year-old practice witnessing and observing, and then relaying like what they've seen. And a lot of times it'll be like, you know, why did 6 cop cars just go across the street? Where are they doing what? And asking those questions too, like, why didn't they just roll down our street? Why are they there? So really engaging my children in the world. And our talk is a lot about their role as white cisgender boys right now. Like, how are they going to stand up for their classmates? When are they going to notice if somebody keeps getting kicked out of the classroom? And how to stand up to it, how to talk to a teacher, how to find an ally at school. And if they don't, like, always keeping it open in our house so we can be talking with each other too.
You know, and I'm just like juggling that around as I think about like that talk. And I love how earlier, Tiffany, you named space, right? And the idea that some kids take up a lot of space. And then when I think about Karyn's work, she talked about sharing through art and through history. And all that is getting me to this place where, you know, we're all educators in some way here, that, we do art, we're in communities, but we're all educators. And we know that you can't teach what you don't know. And so what is the work that adults have to do on themselves in this moment?
I think I like to think about it in three pieces: the personal work, the interpersonal work, and the kind of institutional and systemic work. So the work that we're doing on ourselves, understanding our history, experience, how that's influenced our biases, our assumptions, our interactions. Again, as I said earlier, how our history and understanding that and our place in that, I think, is important work, and understanding that's ongoing. It's not kind of you get to the end of the journey and you're suddenly an anti-racist. That's ongoing work. The interpersonal work, again, Brian Stevenson talks about being proximate to people who are suffering, people who are oppressed. And thinking about the weddings we go to and the parties we go to and the invites we get and who's on that list and how diverse is that list and how proximate are we to the experiences of people who are different from us, I think, is an important part of that work. And understanding how to speak and act and relate across those differences is important. And then, as I said earlier, that systemic work. And I think that one of the Kwame talked about this before we got on live, just, being cynical about a lot that's happening right now, because a lot of folks are putting the statements out. As Dr. Peter said, we're getting the emails, and what action is going to come out of that? And will we find ourselves here again, having the same conversation months, years from now? So what's the work that's happening aside from taking the icons off of the rice boxes? What's the work that's happening on a legislative level, on economic level, in our school systems, that's really going to create a substantive and lasting change for Black folks, folks of color, LGBTQ folks in this country? And I think that working on the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional level, that's I think one of the kind of frameworks to use in terms of doing the work, and knowing that it's not a 1, 2, 3. You don't do this first, then that, then the third. It's integrated and it's ongoing and not ending. And being clear with young people in particular, I think, as Pam said, that we're works in progress. I'm going to get it wrong, and you're going to see that, and I'm going to work to clean it up. And having young children see us in that work, I think, is important as well.
I'll just add thinking about teachers, and I know there are a lot of teachers listening with us tonight, that the work too is just interrogating ourselves, thinking about the language. How are we seeing children? How can we transform, disrupt, completely change the way we talk about children in schools? To me, that's just the way we see them as somehow empty vessels of something we need to fill. That's ridiculous. They come into school with so much. They come with their lives, their histories, their stories. All of that is coming to school with them. And there's a sense in our public system that children are a deficit model. There's something wrong. There's the language around struggling readers. I would like to just completely begin again and talk in a completely different way about what does literacy mean, early literacy, what does that look like, the power of oral literacy, the power of translanguaging, of all the ways that children communicate so brilliantly. Children are brilliant. And I think that we have made this whole way of thinking about teaching, truthfully, we've made it into a pathology. It's as if they're sick with something because they're learning to read. That's just not true. And I think we could do a lot more to transform our schools by interrogating our own language and really saying, how are we naming what we see, and who are who are we journeying with? Because children, young adults are coming with so much, and we turn it around to make it so empty, and that's extremely damaging. And it's just got that, to me, that has to change.
And go ahead. You got it, Karyn.
It might be redundant. It might be something that's been pretty clearly stated, but I just want to say it again, as I think it's really important on that note about with teachers to make sure that they, I mean, this is for everybody, but for adults, but especially with teachers, I think that they have to make sure that you don't just feel, we talk about this with kids and stuff, that you're not racist, but that you're anti-racist, that you are actively trying to, that you're actively doing this, that this isn't, because I think the problem is a lot of people are feeling secure in themselves and they're not asking a lot of hard questions. I mean, I know I'm encountering that with people a lot. And I think that the children are sponges, we know that, and that they're going to pick this up and they're going to feel bias, and they're going to feel when the adults haven't done this work themselves. And I think that, I know, like I said, we've probably been talking about this already, but it's something that I see a lot, and I just wanted to reiterate. I think it's really important that the adults make sure that they are looking hard and answering the hard questions for themselves, and that they're active.
Wow. And all of this has given us so much to think about. And there are folks in our listening audience and in our viewing audience who are thinking alongside us. And you've been submitting questions through Zoom, through Facebook, and on Twitter. And so we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, we're going to be grappling with some of the questions that you have submitted this evening. Thank you for being with us for this important conversation on Kidlit for Black Lives. And we look forward to seeing you just after the break.
Welcome back for the second half of the town hall meeting. We hope you all are getting some information. We hope you are being inspired, and ultimately we hope you are empowered to go back into your homes, into your classroom, and begin this process of creating anti-racist homes, classrooms, and children that can imagine and implement a better world. We're gonna bring our panelists back on now. Cornelius and Karyn and Noni, Dr. Noni and Tiffany and Pam, and we're going to take questions from our audience. Cornelius, we have some questions for each of our panelists. I'm going to take a step back and let you all do your thing. And I want to remind everybody, you can pin the interpreter video by going to those 3 dots up in your right-hand corner, I believe. Thank you for your questions, and let us continue.
All right, and this first question goes directly to you, Pam, from an audience member, and it states, do you believe that teaching young children about racism takes away some of their innocence?
I definitely do not. I think that it's, in fact, I feel just the opposite. I think that it was just the power of earlier, the idea that we talk truth to our children. They are part of the world with us. And I think one of the things that everybody has referred to, and especially because we're here with 2 amazing literary organizations, but I think for our very young children, there are so many beautiful ways through story, through the power of our own stories, but also through the power of our authors, children's book authors who are incredibly wise guides. They somehow, I think some of our best children's book authors they're almost like enchanted from other, I don't even know, I can't even begin to describe it. Even if the book seems simple, they just have a way of telling story and helping me to guide, for myself, thinking about myself as a child and working through some hard parts in my own childhood. I think that the literature was always my companion. And for our children too, I think it is never, just from the very beginning, the idea that from the very first board book, we're going to have those conversations and really open up that inquiry from the very earliest. It's never, we have to do that. We have to do that. It's urgent that we do that now. We didn't do it right before. We've got to do it right now. And from the very minute, we've got to clear the smog. I think that somebody said that, and I think maybe in Tiffany, was it somebody's book that was also stated, the smog of racism is already there. We're already breathing it in. And so let's clear it from the very start. The moment we're holding a very young child and we're reading to them and with them, we can have those conversations, and it's never too early.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pam. And as I'm monitoring the chat coming in, somebody's got a question for me. You know, much of my work is in classrooms and schools as well. And someone says, you know, I teach in rural, predominantly white school district where I've seen and heard lots of fellow teachers preach that all lives matter. I'm willing to take on this fight come September, but I see an uphill battle coming my way. What advice can you give me, especially handling this with small children and elementary children? And one of the things that I've told all of the teachers in schools that I support, whenever the idea of the political comes up, one of the first things that I like to point out is that school is a political construct. And so when folks ask me, Cornelius, what's your political leaning? One of the things that I say is I am radically pro-kid. And here's what that means. We are educators, all of us, you know, those of us who write children's books, those of us who create art, those of us who dance, we, again, are radically pro-kid. And that means that it is our job to create opportunities for children. And eventually, we teach children how to create opportunities for themselves. As such, anything that stands in the way of opportunity for a child is my enemy. So police shooting brown children, you can't read if you're dead. You know, kids being malnourished because they live in food deserts. You can't write powerful poetry if you don't have all your vitamins. And so these issues are teacher issues. And so when people say things like all lives matter, it's really, really important to note that yes, we do understand that all lives matter, but until Black lives matter in a demonstratively clear way through law enforcement, through education, through access to food and medical care, until Black Lives Matter, all lives cannot matter. And so that's been a really important thing. And in closing, one of the things that I have learned from several mentors is that we have to make it profoundly uncomfortable for those educators among us who oppose children. That in my school, we all love children. So if you're on the side of, well, I don't know, or I, don't know what to say about children being shot by police, or I don't know what to say about kids not having enough food to eat. If you don't know what to say, then that means you're not pro-kid, and I've got to make it uncomfortable for you to be here. And so I have tried to spin that discomfort around, really, as you face these uphill battles coming in the fall, really thinking about, I have at my center that all kids should be powerful and successful. And if you don't have the same things at your center, then you might be in the wrong place. And so having those conversations is a really important first step. But I'm going to pass it to Tiffany here, because Tiffany, one of the questions that's coming through, and people want to know specifically, at what age can we approach the topic of police brutality and how? One of the participants says that they don't want their daughter to be afraid of the police, but they want their daughter to understand the complexities of their role.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I have been talking with my kids about police brutality for as long as they've been alive. I remember holding my youngest when he was 3 months old, when Philando Castile died, and talking to his brother, who was 4.5, all about it. And I don't give them all the details, but I do think it is important for them to know that because they're white, that they're going to be okay. Police are going to let them go by, and it's not going to be the same for Indigenous folks or Black folks, brown folks. And I think also, I believe that innocence is one of those constructs of white supremacy culture, and not everybody gets to be innocent. So while a 3-year-old Black child is going to learn all about what is happening with the police because it is the daily thing in their life, a white child isn't going to learn that. And I don't get to decide who gets to be innocent or not. And it goes along with that kind of truth telling. And, my kids don't fear the police, but they know that they need to be wary, and they need to be cautious, and they need to be watching. There are lots of people in our community who can help us. Right now, doesn't feel like the police are those people. We can go to doctors, we can go to nurses, we can go into shops, librarians, teachers. There are a lot of community helpers. I think a lot of times when police brutality comes about, we're always reminded of Mr. Rogers, who reminds us to look for the community helpers, but we need to redefine what community helpers are. And you can talk about police brutality without all of the horrific and gory details, but my children know, we talked about George Floyd and how there were 4 policemen, and one of them hurt him so much that he died, and 3 of them stood around and let it happen. And it's important for them to know, you can't hurt somebody else's body, and you can't stand by and watch it happen too. And police will do that. Citizens will do that. Police they don't have a higher power or a higher order because of their badge. And it's important for our kids to know that. So talk to them as young as you can, because it also weighs on us, and they know what we're feeling and what's bothering us. And if we can be honest with them, Mama's really sad today because this happened. And they're gonna be okay.
And Karyn, this next one is for you. People are thinking even beyond their classroom. How can our parent-teacher organization be a force for good in anti-racism efforts in our schools?
Unmuted. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, certainly. People are wondering, how can parent-teacher organizations be a force for good in anti-racism efforts in our schools?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, I think that I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this, because I'm hearing you guys say some really impressive things in the teaching area. I would love it if somebody else would take that, just because of the teaching arena. I feel like with that, I'm listening so much as a parent with what I experience as a parent, but if somebody else could answer.
Yeah, you know, and Karyn, just like kind of like playing off of that, like one of the things that I think a lot about, you know, I'm in Brooklyn as a dad, and one form that racism takes is the incredible resource hoarding that folks do in communities, you know. And so we think about things like neighborhood zoning and things like that, but just how folks, there are some people in communities who feel like, I can call the superintendent if my kid doesn't make the basketball team, or I can call the teacher if the teacher doesn't have the books that I like. And overwhelmingly, I see in schools that white parents take up a lot of space and engage in a lot of resource hoarding. And so one of the things that I ask my white friends to do is to step back, you know, and Tiffany talked a lot about that earlier, just to take a step back. And is this your fourth phone call to the principal this week? That's a lot of space taken up, or is this your third request of the superintendent this week? And so really, I think one of the ways that PTAs can step in is by examining the kinds of interactions that they have with teachers and with school leaders. And are those interactions in partnerships, or are those interactions where people are demanding things? Dr. Noni, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I also think that there's a great opportunity for groups to have anti-racist training. And I think that PTAs, if that's the acronym we're going to use, should have that as a part of their orientation work, and making sure that the things that they're doing in terms of events that are happening, and the ways that, you know, those groups may be welcoming or not new families into the school, and how that work can be done through an anti-racist lens. And so welcoming that training and making that a part of the work that the group is doing, I think, is important. At Gordon, we have an affinity group for white parents for specifically to do anti-racist work. And there was one incident this year where I sent a communication to the community, and it landed for some white parents, made them uncomfortable because I had mentioned something about race. And it was, the conversations actually started in our parent association. And there, I believe there are other parents in that group who were part of the anti-racist white parent affinity group, who were able to say, to give some context to my words that they hadn't thought of before, and then invite them to the affinity group and say, let's talk more about that in that space. Do you imagine the emotional labor that takes off me as a Black head of school to not take that on, because there are white parents in our school who are willing to call in folks to that conversation, and there's a space on campus to do that. So I think that sometimes those affinity spaces, for understandable reasons, you have a white parents group at your school, like that can bring up some questions. But to know that is to examine whiteness, to deconstruct, you know, and look at white privilege, to make sure that white folks in the community are doing that work and have a space to do that work, I think has given us, has moved us in a really important place at Gordon towards creating a more inclusive and more belonging community, because there aren't just one group of folks doing that work.
And I would love to speak a little bit about how that looks in public schools. We are, our families joined our local public school this year, and it was amazing. The PTO raised money so none of the students had to buy any school supplies. And that right there, like, I think is amazing. I've always had to buy school supplies for my child, and this year we didn't. And then we also went through a head of school search. This is a school that has an anti-bias, anti-racist, a public school anti-bias, anti-racist mission. And it's such a dope school. And the new head of school, the two that the superintendent's committee came about, they were talking and we were like, where did they come from? Like, do they even know who this school is? And the parents had organized themselves, and the questions they were asking, they were like, and what are you going to do to support our Black and brown families and children? And what are you going to do to further our anti-racist mission? And when the white candidates did not answer, those white parents held them accountable to it. And they, like, to the point where like the candidates were like trying to sputter out the word anti-racist. You can tell it was like the first time they said it. And that, I think that is some of the powerful work that parents and caregivers can do in schools too.
And a lot of people this evening have been thinking, and this is a question for you, Karyn, that if I'm a parent or an educator or school adjacent, when I make a mistake and bias presents itself, when I'm working with my coworkers of color, how do I address that hurt in order to move forward?
Well, I think it's a word we keep hearing a lot. Tiffany keeps talking about it, is about the truth and about honesty. I think that's what we have to come back to. If somebody's really if people are trying and you get called out because of something, then you listen and you take that. I hope that, I know that a lot of people are nervous in this time. I'm seeing a lot of that. People are afraid of making mistakes. And I was talking earlier about kids that I know are afraid of making mistakes, and it's going to happen. There's been so much that's been just everybody's been going along and trying to pretend, if you're not affected by racism, that it's just not there because it's uncomfortable. And so I think hopefully this is not just a moment, but I mean, this continues, this is a movement. And it's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. But that's just, and everyone's going to have to get used to that and accept that. And I think that goes for everybody to try to keep pushing it through. And yeah, just ask questions and listen. Do your best.
And it's so interesting because people are so interested in being active. So Dr. Noni, this one is yours. But do you have any suggestions? You talked about events, but do you have any suggestions for recognizing Juneteenth and lessons tomorrow?
Wow, I'm really excited about the ways that this has gotten on the radars of so many people, and I think that it was Pam who said it earlier about taking the lead from students. I think whenever there's so many resources out there, I think teaching tolerance is always a good go-to in terms of specific lessons around a particular moments in history or dates on our calendar. But I also think our students are really great resources for considering what those celebrations and conversations should look like. And taking some time again to get into the history. I know I sound like a broken record and coming back to that, but what we don't want to do is have Juneteenth turn into a foods, and festival type of a day. I joked with a friend that, Target probably already has their Juneteenth, t-shirt section being created right now. And so I think that the resources that we have at our hand, Howard Zinn does a history of the people's history. There's a YA version of that, stamped from the beginning. There is that's for younger readers. It gives us access to tell that story in ways that are accessible for young people. So I would say to stay away from things that feel like let's make this bulletin board and come in your favorite Juneteenth outfit. I'm exaggerating a bit to make a point, but I think that having some thoughtful diving into the history, and then also conversations about why don't we know about this? James Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's a great resource, I think, for teachers. And I remember, Cornelius, you're a middle school person, and so am I. I remember bringing some of that. I thought it was too much. I thought it was too hard. I did not think it was accessible. 7th graders ate it up, and they're like, why aren't we learning this? So I think there's an opportunity to access the history and then interrogate why is this becoming just a thing now?
Yeah, and Dr. Noni, you're making me think about that line in the Gil Scott-Heron poem, like my red, black, and green liberation jumpsuit that I've been saving for just the proper occasion. So yes, so are y'all ready? Because it's about to get deep. So we've got now the after 8 questions are coming in. And anyone can answer this one. And I've got some thoughts here certainly, but how do we metaphorically burn it down? Because the current model only perpetuates a false sense of racial superiority for white kids and maintains racial bias. So how do we burn it down?
Okay.
Yeah, and I know, yeah, we think about this every day, Tiffany. So
I know.
So I got the matches in my back pocket. So go ahead.
I mean, I don't have pockets, but they're around. So I love Dr. Jamila Elias Scott's book, Black Appetite, White Food. And in it, she talks a lot about we need to know what we're fighting for. Because you spend so much time fighting against a system, fighting against it just exhausts you. And when you know what you're fighting for, then you can keep doing it. And for me, like, in the field of education, the way we burn it, like, it needs to be burned down because it's not working. And I use the tools of anti-bias education to really spark how I interact with all of my students and all of the adults. And it's a framework that was created for our youngest and early childhood education, and it works for everybody, regardless of your age. The first goal is you learn to love yourself. And when we can learn to love ourselves and honor who we are, like, I can honor me, and I can honor you, Cornelius, and I can honor Karyn, and I can honor Pam, and I can honor Nona. Like, when we can honor each other too and understand that our differences we're different, and hopefully in alignment for the fact that we need liberation in order to all be free. Then we can start to stand up and work in solidarity together. But we have to know ourselves before we try to do this whole dismantling of a system, because if we don't know ourselves, then we aren't going to understand how we have been impacted by this system.
Absolutely. And Pam, I'm looking at you here just because so much of my pedagogy is what I've learned from you, and so when I think about imagining how things can be, your face pops up a little bit in my mind. And so any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do have some thoughts. I think one thought is, when I think about the idea of just change it all, is thinking about how we measure what we mean by success in school, right? So I do think the standardized tests are racist. I think that they are wrong. I think that we're not doing right for our kids with them. I think it's been really hard for teachers to push back on that because it's been so strong against our voices in that. So I think that for me, there would be a lot in the system that I would love to, let's just transform it while we've had this time away and distance learning and thinking about trauma. Kids have been through a lot in these last 3 months, a lot. And I think teachers are really finding within themselves, I know for me working with teachers a lot over these last 3 months and seeing their pain and anguish and not being able to be near their children, their students, not to have that nearness to them and saying, wait a minute, if everything else was gone, what I would really want is just to be near my children, to hear their stories, to be accompanying them in this journey. To be so far away from them right now feels really hard. And so it's almost like everything is, you can see the path to something different. And I think that's one way to think about it. And then the other is to that idea of love at the center love at the center. I think we have a very hard time talking about love in the midst of pain. I do. And I think children, they see love is always at the center. And as much as this might sound, to me, for working with children and being with them so much, they are so interested to have these conversations. They're so interested in what grown-ups think about things. They see us as mentors, even when we're not perfect, when we get it all wrong, when we make a mistake. And I think to go back to that place, to the burning it down, to me would be to say, let's turn this whole thing upside down and actually listen to children. Let's stop talking so much to them. Let's stop teaching so much to them, and let's step back and actually really, really listen. If you ask children what they think about the state of the world right now, or what they would create, or what they would imagine, what they would build, at Lit World, all across the world, we create maps of the heart. And we talk a lot about this idea of what are you building for yourself? What are you making for yourself? Who are you today? And tomorrow, who are you going to become? And that sense of agency and empowerment through their own stories and their own words, to me, that in a way, that is burning it up, because they know, they're incredibly, that idea of love at the center, to me, that's the real burning. That's the real burning.
And our audience is really thinking actively about the things that we've been saying in this last few minutes. And so here's another question. Again, this is for anybody, but what is the best approach for colleagues who think that the things that we're talking about tonight should be taught at home? People say, leave the race talk at home, leave the gender identity stuff at home, and come to school and just do math and just do social studies. What's the best approach for those colleagues?
I like to make an analogy to sex education, which sometimes that's a similar argument. That's a better conversation for home, and families should have that. Children are going to have that conversation. It's going to happen outside the home. It's going to happen on the playground. Do you want to be a part of it, or do you not? And so I think that's the same tack that we should take around race. Do you want them breathing in the smog without your input, your interjection, your experience, your love, or not? And I think that for schools, we can't abdicate our responsibility around education. We're called into partnership with families to make sure that our messages are aligned, that we are providing resources for families to be able to have this conversation, particularly with young children. And if we're thinking about preparing our children for the world that we're living in, we would be abdicating our responsibility as educators by not having these conversations in classroom spaces. And waiting to have these conversations until middle school or high school when we think they're ready is, again, letting a lot of stuff happen and getting in way and late in the game before we're able to turn around some of the messages that Black children may be internalizing about themselves, negative messages there, and messages that white children may be internalizing about what it means to be white and what it means to be a person of color in this country. So it's an essential part of an educational process in this country to make sure that race and anti-racism work is a part of the process.
Wow. And this next question, I just saw it come on the screen and I started tearing up a little bit just thinking about it. But this one really is for Black educators specifically. Is this work stressful for you, and why do you do it? And then what self-care practices do you all engage in?
I'll speak. I also like speaking, recognizing that I'm light. I walk through the world as a light Black biracial woman. And it's super stressful. And it's stressful because, so I work in a school and live in a town that is very predominantly white. And so a lot of times I'm the only one bringing up race or doing this work. And it's super stressful. And I also feel like I can't not do it. I am one of those people who like always needs to be doing stuff, but also having lived my life navigating and understanding whiteness in a very like close way, I feel like I can't not use that kind of superpower to break down the system and to do this work for all Black and Indigenous and Brown students. It's exhausting, but it's necessary.
Yeah, and I so see you, Tiffany, and I think of, yeah, this is very stressful, and this has perhaps been one of the most stressful periods of my life. Almost anybody who knows my work knows that I have studied for years. My aspiration was to be the best reading teacher in New York City. Like that, when I was in college, I was like, man, I'm going to teach these read alouds and I'm going to read these poems and I'm going to be the best teacher of reading in New York City. And just that one of the things that racism does is it robs you of your dreams, right? That like, I wanted to be a reading teacher and I am a reading teacher, but then every other month I have to defend Blackness. And every other month I have to step in and ease the trauma of my students, and every other month I've got to support my parents. And so, I started this journey wanting to sit cross-legged on the carpet with books and poems. And this world has turned me into a warrior. And so for me, my great stress comes from the reality that I have been robbed of my dreams by racism, and that's huge. And it's so beautiful to look out at this screen and to see all of you. I see Dr. Noni leading a school, and what do you do for self-care?
I think one of the things that has brought me peace in this work is actually just working with other educators of color who work in predominantly white independent schools. I started my educational journey in private schools for my middle school and high school career. I was the only Black female in my class, did not have a teacher of color the entire time I was at that school. And actually my first teaching job was back at that school that I graduated from, and knew then that I wanted to be a leader in this work so that I could be someone around the table that was thinking about that Black girl like me who was moving through that space. So I've chosen to work in independent schools because of my experience. And, if we talked about burning it, down, working in, some of the most exclusive schools in the country, my work is primarily in New York. And doing this work is where I kind of, have seen my path in terms of breaking down racism in educational systems. So the work that I do for educators, I founded and work with some amazing educators on our faculty of the Interschool Leadership Institute for Educators of Color. And this is a week-long institute run in New York for educators of color, and working in predominantly white spaces, independent schools, but we've had other folks join us. And that the week centers those educators and their experience. And it really is about thinking about how do we sustain ourselves, how do we create networks that sustain us through this work. So it's an affinity space, and I think that's important for schools and organizations and businesses to recognize the importance of affinity spaces for folks of color, to not be afraid of those spaces, fear that they're kind of we're segregating ourselves in those spaces. Those are spaces where we rejuvenate ourselves, connect, make sure we aren't being gaslighted, get away from the am I crazy, did this really happen spaces. And that mental piece that comes with connecting with other folks who are sharing your experience, I think is key to the work. And for those educators who find themselves as the only one, my hope is that spaces like this institute create a network across the country, and we have folks from across the pond as well. American School of London, we have a couple of folks who've come from there to the institute. And to have that connection, I know, has sustained many of those educators in the work. So as much as we can create those spaces for others, mentoring is a huge part that brings me joy and peace and rejuvenates me. I learn so much from the people that I mentor. I don't know if they know how much they give to me, but giving to others and creating that safe and sacred space for educators of color to rejuvenate themselves is something that I've benefited from through my career and really feel blessed to be able to create for others.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I'm just sitting in those words. And this last question from our viewing audience is really for all of us. And people are really wondering, how do I take this conversation, that I might have had here this evening or with students, and how do I take this conversation to the next level so that district leadership recognizes that changes need to be made so that all students feel represented?
Don't lose your stamina. I think a lot of folks, there's big hype and there's a lot of awakeness, and it's really important to not sleep on it. I see people losing stamina and it hurts because I'm like, this is why you got to know what you're fighting for and take it to the district. I mean, as a teacher, as parents, as caregivers, as librarians, you have power. And I felt like I had more autonomy as a classroom teacher than I did as an administrator, because I was working directly with students and families every single day. And it was important for me to be able to relay what they were feeling, what they were going through, and then challenge my head of school, I sat in a meeting last week for our district improvement plan and asked the superintendent, like, hey, we're all talking about equity here, but what do you mean by that? Like, what is this definition that everybody's throwing around? And don't be afraid. Just like go forth and do it, because if you're not going to, somebody else might not.
I agree with Tiffany in terms of just taking on a leadership stance, whether you're in a classroom or in a formal leadership, position. And doing the work of developing yourself as a leader. I thought wrongly for a long time that because I'm an introvert or because it's not my first instinct to kind of be in front of people in ways that I saw leaders that I admired be, that I was not going to be or could not be a leader. And once I understood that there are skills around leadership that I could learn, I ate up everything that I could and wanted to pass that on to others. And I think that good leaders, I think, cultivate and grow other leaders. And so doing the work of developing your leadership toolkit. I love Adrienne Marie Brown's work around movement building and the skills it takes to do and sustain movement building. Like, those are all things we have access to. That information we all have access to, and the ability to grow ourselves into folks who can lead and fight and sustain change.
And I would say I love how everybody created this environment here, and Kwame helped us to begin that around inquiry. So Cornelius, you led us in some beautiful questions, and then the community that you all created here tonight gave us more questions. And I love that idea of taking that back to districts to say we're all asking questions as inquiry. Should not be on somebody to answer, but for all of us to ask. And I think that idea of leading with inquiry, that again, I'm always led by children, and I think they do that really well. They have so many questions and they want to talk about those questions. But I also think for adults, I think we have to, it's so much to figure things out, but I love the idea of leading with inquiry, coming to the table with those inquiry questions, and also using text. Again, thank you to the literacy organizations here tonight, using the texts that have been written whether written by young people in our school districts, having them bring those narratives to us so we can share and use those as our shared text, and also the amazing books that we can use as a way to build our own inquiry communities. I think it was Bettina Love who said that she wants to create communities or a sense of safe spaces around justice. And I love that idea that we can have inquiry conversations around justice, and let that be the way you begin in your district.
Absolutely. It has been beyond moving to sit and listen and to live in your words this evening. So thank you, Karyn. Thank you, Dr. Noni. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Pam. I am Cornelius Minor, and I'm going to turn this panel back over to my brother, Kwame.
The night is beautiful, so the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful, so the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun. Beautiful also are the souls of my people. You've witnessed some beautiful souls tonight. Souls, come back, don't leave. You witnessed some beautiful souls tonight bearing their heart love, bearing their truths, sharing with you all the hopes and the dreams that we hope come into fruition. Cornelius is he coins these terms that I tend to borrow, and so I'm gonna borrow this one. This is not a time for performative allyship. This is real work. Teachers, librarians, your work is sacred. You have the capacity to build and mold and shape beautiful human beings or destroy them. I'd like us to take a moment of silence to acknowledge and recognize and remember the lives of Black men and boys and women who have been blown away like sand in a windstorm. We have the capacity to make that page blank. We have the capacity to honor the humanity of all of our citizens. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight to the Kid Lit for Black Lives Town Hall meeting on anti-racism. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to ILA. Thank you to SCBWI. And thank you to you. Thank you to you for being willing, for being open to learn. to listen, to love, to be better, to say something, to do something. Have a great summer. Have a great school year.
Kwame, thank you for inviting ILA to be a part of this incredible journey. There's much work to be done. One of the things that I took away tonight as a superintendent, outside of my role as vice president and president-elect of the board of ILA, is that we must never come to a place that we're afraid to lose our jobs. And I think much of the narrative here today shaped that dynamic. We have so many people who depend upon their jobs, but they allow their jobs, the fear on their jobs, to impede the work on their jobs. If you lose your job, we'll find you another one. There's work to be done. Thank you, ILA staff, because we are nothing without you. To our panelists, continue to work and allow your gifts to serve the world. Tiffany, you woke me up tonight because I'm tired. I've been doing this work for 37 years, not feeling like I've ever had a job. And so I'll wake up in the morning, rejuvenated and ready to move forward to do more work. God bless you all. April Powers, thank you for joining us as well.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. I am looking forward to our next conversation. This is recorded, so I'm looking forward to listening to it again. We had quotes this morning at SCBWI from our favorite, Black quotes, which I had earlier. Cornelius, I'm radically for children. I am radically for children, and we at SCBWI stand radically for children. And that's going to be part of our new motto. Because if you're not radically for children, who are you? If you're only for yourself, who are you? We can no longer only be for ourselves. It isn't working. And thank you all for continuing this great conversation, for being so raw, so honest, so real, for giving me new language. And I've been in this inclusion game for a long time, but you've all given me new stories and new voices. And I hope that we'll continue the dialogue, and it won't just be talk, it will be action. So thank you. Thank you, Stephen, also for your great words. And Kwame, you rock.
This is like hashtag kid lit for Black Lives after the show, I guess. Hey, look, like Langston said, laughing to keep from crying. Hey, love everybody. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you somewhere. I'm in LA. I'm on the East Coast all the time. Reach out.